Jack the Ripper was the first modern serial killer. In the East End of London in 1888, he butchered at least 5 women, and the police couldn't catch him.
All the things that we would do at a crime scene now, they weren't able to do then. They didn't have fingerprints, couldn't blood group, blood type.
Laura Richards is a behavioural psychologist working with the Violent Crime Command at London Scotland Yard. She's agreed to re-examine the facts of a case that has been buried by conspiracy theories and myth. Laura brings the experience of a decade studying the most dangerous, hard-to-catch criminals, serial rapists and killers. She'll pull together a team of experts who'll use the techniques of 21st century policing to help her get inside the killer's mind.
Jack the Ripper is a challenge for us. We don't understand why someone would want to eviscerate women in the manner that he did. We don't understand who he is.
Geographic profiling, digital imaging, and the DNA analysis of evidence that's never been tested before will produce the most detailed picture yet of the man the police were after. Where he lived, what he looked like, how he killed, and why he killed. Laura Richards will reveal for the first time the secret of how history's most notorious murderer managed to escape justice. More than a century after he stalked the streets, the hunt for Jack the Ripper has begun again.
She was my wife, Polly Nichols.
She was my sister Annie, the widow of John Chapman.
You've got an offender who's prolific, who's predatory, who's killing women.
We lived together as man and wife. Her name was Liz Strider.
And not only killing them, he's mutilating them and leaving them out publicly, displayed. I think there's certainly a sense of injustice.
Her name was Catherine Eddowes.
To Laura Richards, the case of Jack the Ripper is unfinished business.
I think there are many features that really grip me about this particular case. Not only the fact that it happened in London, it's my home force, it's where I work. I think the vulnerability of the victims, you know, the way that they lived, the sadness of their lives, the way it began and the way that it also ended.
Laura's job is behavioural analysis. Every single thing that a killer does says something about who he is. The crimes of Jack the Ripper are over a century old, but she can still decode them.
For me, heading up the Homicide Prevention Unit, there are still valuable lessons to be learned. Ultimately, you want to try and prevent any future crimes from happening.
These horrific crimes have been a source of shock and fascination over the decades. But the known facts have been obscured. Over 200 suspects have been named. There's been endless speculation, and still the case has never been solved. The police of Victorian London were certain that these were the crimes of a madman. A harmless mental patient by the name of Aaron Kosminski became a prime suspect because he ate from the gutter and claimed to hear voices. Later came the conspiracy theories. Was the killer perhaps Prince Albert Edward, Queen Victoria's grandson and the heir to the throne?
Complete pack of nonsense. Alibi for every night in question, virtually.
Was it Victoria's physician, William Gull, engaged in a Masonic plot?
Every time this nonsense has to be cleared away, and yet it still doesn't stop people from pushing more and more suspects forward.
The name Jack the Ripper helped sell newspapers. The press made him a legend. Hunt the Ripper became a game. And because he was the first of his kind, the first modern serial killer, the police were simply not equipped to hunt him down. They closed the investigation after 4 fruitless years. Laura's agreed to return to it, focusing on the core facts.
What do we actually know about what's gone on, and therefore what can we infer about the offender without getting involved with anything around suspects, working it as we would do any normal case.
The end goal is a complete psychological examination of the killer. The starting point is what Laura calls victimology. You get to the killer by knowing his victims.
If you find out how someone lived, it may give you a clue as to how they died.
It's generally accepted that there were 5 Ripper victims, beginning with Polly Nichols. 43 years old, with adult children, separated from her husband. She had no permanent home, was often on the streets. She was an alcoholic.
She got drunk every time I took her back. That's why I had to leave her altogether.
To understand how the Ripper's reign of terror began, Laura has to visit the crime scene.
A picture paints 1,000 words, but going to a scene paints 1,000,000, and that's a really important part of what I do.
This is Bucks Road. This is where the first of the murders took place, the murder of Polly Nichols, in the early hours of the 31st of August, 1888.
Ripper expert Don Rumbelow knows these streets better than anyone. He was a beat officer with the City of London Police. Bucks Row lies in the heart of London's East End. Of all the 5 murder sites, this is the one that's changed least.
Well, the old schoolhouse behind us, this was here in 1888, but the street itself was just a row of small terraced houses. She was lying in the stable gateway here. It was very gloomy, and the only light was at the far end of the street. Feet this end, head that way.
And who actually found her?
The body was found by 2 men on their way to work, Charles Cross and John Paul. Cross was the first to see her. He thought it was a tarpaulin in the road. It was only when he moved across that he actually saw that it was a body. It wasn't until the body was examined in the mortuary that it was discovered that she had these large gashes to the abdomen. There was one sort of large gash about sort of 6 to 8 inches in length, another gash on the other side, but there were cross cuts as well.
Polly's injuries went far beyond what was necessary to cause death. Her sexual organs were mutilated. Laura wants to know why.
Is it about just killing the victim and then leaving, so it's all about the kill, or is it about other behaviours that he wants to carry out on the victim?
Polly wasn't raped, but the nature and the intensity of the attack say something about the killer's state of mind.
She wasn't raped, but we can't rule out the fact that it's a sexually motivated crime. And that kind of level of violent behaviour, he may well have been sexually quite high at the time. And I believe what we're looking at with Jack the Ripper is a sexual homicide.
The sexual motive tells Laura that this must have been the work of a man. But Laura needs to understand what drew the killer to Polly Nichols. She needs to know her story.
Everything about that individual, from perhaps where they shot to who's in their life, have they got a boyfriend, partners, who their family makeup is.
Somewhere in the victim's life is the key to why she died, the reason why Jack the Ripper chose her.
She was my wife. I don't think she had any enemies. She was too good for that.
Laura will consult a pathologist to work out exactly how the Ripper killed, and she'll search for patterns in these murders, clues to the person responsible. She has access to techniques, tools, and expertise that the investigators of 1888 could not have imagined. But investigating a case that's more than 100 years old presents its own challenge. These crimes took place in a world that doesn't exist anymore. If she's going to understand what's happened, she's going to need to build a picture of Whitechapel, the square mile of East London that was Polly Nichols' home and the Ripper's killing ground.
So why was Polly at Bucks Row?
Probably looking for a customer. She'd had 3 customers that day, but she'd spent the money on gin.
So she was a prostitute?
She was a prostitute, and she felt she was going to get another customer. She was going to get a 4th customer because she got a new hat, and she thought she was looking very attractive. She was drunk, but she thought she was looking very attractive.
Sex workers, prostitutes tend to be more often than not the victim of crime because of availability and opportunity.
Polly Nichols' lifestyle made her vulnerable. Even before the Ripper, the place where she lived was already the toughest area in London.
55% of all children born in the East End were dead before the age of 5.
This was a society ruled by poverty and drink. Alcohol had hit the poor of London in the same way that crack would hit American cities a century later.
You have
Right.
drunkenness, you have battered wives, you have battered children, you have violence. This is all generated by the brutality of the social conditions of living and working, or trying to work, in the East End of London.
Women like Polly had to turn to prostitution to get by. By some calculations, 1 in 16 dwellings functioned as a brothel. And in the single square mile covered by the Whitechapel district, there were as many as 5,000 prostitutes.
Now, to give you some idea of sort of values, imagine these women are prostituting themselves for 2pence, 3pence, or a loaf of stale bread.
Not only Polly Nichols, but all 5 of the Ripper's victims lived in these conditions, in this community.
This is probably the only serial killer case I can think of where you can walk all the crime scenes in less than 2 hours. All these crimes have occurred within 1 mile radius. He's chosen to go there. It's all through his choice.
This environment clearly suited the Ripper's purposes. But was he what criminal psychologists call a poacher, someone who came from outside Whitechapel just to hunt? Or was he a marauder, attacking within his own community? Laura turns to a mapping technique called geographic profiling. It's used by law enforcement agencies around the world to interpret crime scene locations. Geoprofiling was invented by Dr. Kim Rosmo of the Texas State University. He's an ex-cop and a mathematician, and some years ago, he spotted that it's possible to use crime locations to identify where the perpetrator has his base, his home.
Most criminals operate out of their home in terms of their search for criminal targets. Criminals commit crimes close to where they live, but not too close. They're affected by concerns over anonymity and not wanting to hunt in an area where they might be identified.
Dr. Rosmo uses a formula based on data from dozens of solved cases. It interprets crime sites and key features of the area, homes, roads, public spaces. He then calculates where the offender comes from.
We use a computer program to do upwards of 1 million calculations to determine the most likely area.
It produces a map where color indicates probability. The offender's home is least likely to be in the black areas, most likely to be in the red. Given that the Ripper killings all took place within 1 square mile, it should be possible for Dr. Rosmo to pinpoint the street where the police of 1888 ought to have started their hunt. While Laura waits for the results of the geographic profile, she looks at the circumstances of the second killing. It happened 9 days after Polly's body was found, and only half a mile away, in Hanbury Street. The victim's name was Annie Chapman. In 1888, this building, Shoreditch Town Hall, housed a coroner's court. It heard the details of the Ripper's crimes. Today, Laura's come here to talk to Neil Sheldon. He studied the victims' lives, and according to him, Annie Chapman's life was on a downward spiral.
Can you just tell me a bit more about that, Neil?
Yes, they all come from very ordinary working class backgrounds. Only Annie Chapman possibly came from slightly better off background.
Her husband died 18 months ago now. After that, she rather gave up.
They lived a very ordinary life together. John had got some work with a gentleman in Bond Street. He worked for as a coachman, but unfortunately Annie had apparently been stealing from this person, and so they lost their jobs. At this time it was more than likely that they started to drink.
She'd certainly had enough that night.
Right, so that was quite typical, and we certainly know that she was also a commercial sex worker or a prostitute.
Yes, she resorted to that on occasions, yes.
The yard where Annie was killed doesn't exist anymore. But to understand what happened, Laura needs to build a mental picture of the crime scene. She consults photographs and contemporary drawings. A model marks the way that the body was positioned.
Imagine that this is 29 Hanbury Street, and behind us is a row of 3-storey Victorian terraced houses.
At around 6 a.m. on the morning of the 8th of September, John Davis, a wagon driver, came down the stairs of number 29. He was leaving for work. He saw that the back door was slightly ajar. He went to investigate.
The head was 6 inches in front of the bottom step. The left arm lay across the left breast. The legs were drawn up, the feet resting on the ground, and the knees turned outward.
My initial thoughts on this scene are that it's not too dissimilar from Polly Nichols, the way that the victim has been left, certainly in an exposed way.
The cut on Annie Chapman's neck was so deep that it almost severed her head. Part of her uterus was missing. Her intestines had been drawn out and thrown up over her left shoulder. One witness from the scene described its effect.
Every person who had seen the body looked afraid, as if they wanted to run away.
There are some things that are purely functional. For example, overpowering the victim, trying to stop her from screaming, incapacitating her in the quickest time possible. But there are certainly other things that he's doing that are peculiar to him. He gains a form of enjoyment. These things are unique to that particular offender. It's certainly a conscious decision to actually open up someone's intestine, remove part of it and take what we think, some of it with him, the uterus, and place the other part of it up by the top of the victim's head.
Laura sees signs that even while he was killing, the Ripper was thinking about the consequences. He would generate shock and fear, and that was part of the thrill.
The body has been displayed intentionally and left in that way for a purpose. He's interested in people's reaction and the impact of what he's done.
He may have been calculating, planning. But he'd also put himself in a situation where the chance of being caught was very high. No fewer than 17 people lived at 29 Hanbury Street, coming and going at all hours. He could easily have been disturbed.
When you know that it's a very busy area that he's chosen to attack the victim and indeed the victims in, it's certainly telling us that he is willing to take a high risk.
This tells Laura about the Ripper's self-control. He either can't resist the need to kill, regardless of what might happen to him, or he is disciplined, confident, weighing up the odds and playing them. It's Annie Chapman's behavior which points to the answer. She almost certainly went with him of her own accord. If she'd been forced, if there'd been a struggle, it would have been heard. She probably thought he was a customer. He must have looked like a man who would do her no harm. He must have put her at her ease. The police of 1888 thought they were looking for an obvious lunatic, someone more animal than man. But the killer Laura sees doesn't fit any of the stereotypes.
The off-the-shelf profile would state that this offender has low interpersonal skills, cannot communicate with women, would not have a relationship with women. I just don't buy into that. That's not something that I've seen over the 10 years of working violent crime. A lot of these offenders do have relationships with women.
It appears that the Ripper managed to conceal what he was until the last second. To Laura, the point when sex became murder, when he showed his true intentions to his victim, is when he revealed most about himself. This moment will now become her focus. Jack the Ripper knew what he was doing, so Laura needs to know, in detail.
Violence is a choice. He's chosen to do that, to express himself in that way. And in the cold light of day, we're trying to make sense of what he's done.
She turns to Peter Dean. He's a coroner and a police surgeon for a division of London that includes Whitechapel. If the Ripper struck today, it would be on Peter Dean's patch. As an expert witness, his job is the interpretation of wounds. And by looking at what happened across all the killings, he's able to build a picture of how the Ripper claimed a victim. He breaks an attack down into distinct phases: controlling, killing, and mutilating.
In a sense, he's got three things to do, and the first two have to be achieved quite quickly. He's got to overpower the victim.
In a short space of time.
A very short space of time, and the evidence seems to be, certainly for some of the murders, that he did that by asphyxiation. Certainly in the Annie Chapman situation, where the police surgeon, Dr. George Baxter Phillips, describes the body, he describes this body with this swollen tongue and the appearance of somebody who's been asphyxiated.
The myth that's grown around the Ripper centers on the way he mutilated his victims. But contrary to what most people assume, that was not the way he killed them. He strangled them first.
I know from a lot of my work, it's actually quite hard to kill a victim using manual strangulation.
Yeah. If you're talking about a purely asphyxial process, it takes time, it takes force. If they're not already dead from asphyxia, he's confirming it with the cut throat.
And then, whilst they're on the ground, he then does the mutilations and what he's now become infamous for, the rippings.
Absolutely.
This phase is, in Laura's eyes, the Ripper's goal. He goes beyond the functional business of control and killing to doing those things which excite him and satisfy him.
It tells you about, in terms of the signature, about his fantasy base. It tells you about the fact that he's deriving some form of pleasure. I would infer that it's something about anger, something about power and control.
He didn't kill by cutting. He killed in order to cut. This part of what he did has been a source of grim fascination ever since the crimes were committed. It's also given rise to one of the great myths about the case. The idea that the perpetrator was a surgeon has refused to go away. It started with the doctor who performed Annie Chapman's post-mortem, who thought he saw signs of surgical training, but his theory had little support.
Later doctors have disagreed with that, and Dr. Bond, who reviewed all of the post-mortems, and it was his view that this was somebody who didn't have any anatomical or surgical knowledge, nor even the knowledge that would have been obtained by working as a butcher or a horse slaughterer or the other things that would have gone on at that particular time.
To Laura, the question of how skilled the Ripper was distracts from something far more important: the psychological drive it takes to inflict this much damage on another person.
We look at it quite coldly. It's happened and we're being very matter-of-fact, but to kill someone actually takes an awful lot.
Laura has spent years studying killers and what motivates them. Jack the Ripper struck more than 100 years ago, but she sees little difference between him and modern serial offenders.
I've collected a large database of violent and serial offenders and then tracked them right back to their childhood to see what's gone on. Something that's traumatic, something, around physical, emotional, sometimes psychological abuse, which has led them to become the person they are. Powerless people will always seek to take the power back, and I put Jack the Ripper in that bracket.
Laura's experience tells her that the Ripper's cruelty had its roots in something he himself had suffered. According to Peter Dean, the way he chose to vent his anger enabled him to inflict horrendous damage and make good his escape without covering himself in blood.
How much blood would Jack the Ripper have had on him?
Clearly with eviscerations like this, it's a bloody business from that point of view. If, though, they've actually been killed, asphyxiated, before he then cuts the throat, there'll be relatively less bleeding from that point of view.
Because the heart stopped pumping?
Absolutely. So you've not got blood at arterial pressure pumping out. And it's a late night situation that he's working in. If he's got a dark coat on him, again, that's going to cover a lot. He's got more of a chance of blending in as he makes his escape.
It meant that he could complete what he wanted to do, then disappear. Jack the Ripper had struck twice now in the space of a month. After 2 killings, the government and the people of London realized that they were facing something different and frightening. As they waited to see if he would strike again, they could not know that he would take his next 2 victims within the space of 1 hour, or that he would leave behind a trail of evidence that can still be followed more than a century later. To Laura, the amount of time that's passed is irrelevant. She approaches the Ripper case with the same tools that she would use if she were assisting police in a modern-day murder case. She now receives a visit from her old mentor, John Grieve. He retired from the Met in 2002 as one of London's most senior and respected policemen. He's tackled some of the largest and most complex manhunts in the history of this city. He's also an expert on the Ripper case and brings news of a new development in the story. It relates to Jack's 4th victim, Catherine Eddowes. It had been thought that no physical evidence survives from the case, but someone has come forward claiming to own a piece of clothing, a shawl that was taken from Eddowes' body. A team of forensic scientists have gone to take samples. The authenticity of the shawl is far from certain. It belongs to the descendants of one of the policemen who attended the scene. Though it's in private ownership now, it spent some time in the Crime Museum at New Scotland Yard. And if it is genuine, it is the last physical link that anyone has to the Ripper crimes.
So there is what is said to be Catherine Eddowes' shawl. Well, you know, if we don't do a test on it, we won't know whether we can match some of the DNA to some of her surviving relatives.
DNA samples are useless without something with which to compare them. But there's been a development there too. Catherine Eddowes' descendants have been traced and contacted. They've agreed to give DNA swabs.
As long as that shawl has never been anywhere near the family, if you can just prove that distance, then you might be able to prove that that was in fact Catherine Eddowes' shawl. You don't know until you test it.
If a link is established between Catherine Eddowes and the shawl, then any other genetic material will have to be recorded and preserved for use in any future investigation. This may be the last chance anyone has to get the DNA of the Ripper from one of his victims. Catherine Eddowes was killed on the 30th of September 1888. Ripperologists call that night the double event, because it also saw the death of another woman, Liz Stride. This was the most well-documented night of the Ripper's career. Using police records, witness statements, and testimony from the coroner's court, it's possible to construct a precise timeline of what happened where. Laura's going to pool her expertise with that of John Grieve. He's handled dozens of difficult police investigations. They're going to track Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes through their final hours. At 8 o'clock on the morning of the 29th, Catherine Eddowes was seen leaving a pawnbroker's shop. She'd hocked a pair of work boots belonging to her partner, John Kelly. She got 2 shillings and 6pence, and she spent it all on food.
That certainly tells me something about total poverty if you're having to sell your shoes.
Well, how's he going to get his boots back to go back to work on Monday morning? Where's she going to get 2 and 6pence from?
It's known that Catherine Eddowes worked as a prostitute, and she certainly got more money somehow because she started drinking heavily. Police reports place her in Aldgate High Street at 6 o'clock.
She's blind drunk, which renders her vulnerable, which again is a third time that that's actually happened across these particular cases.
A mile away, Liz Stride had been drinking too. She was spotted at the Queen's Head public house and later at the bar of the Bricklayers Arms.
There wasn't a great deal else for them to do, quite frankly, was there? Just drink and sex, and that's about it.
Like Catherine, Elizabeth Stride was a prostitute. We know she was born in 1843 in Sweden, but much of her story is confused because Liz told lies about her past.
She told me that she'd been married and that her husband died when the Princess Alice sank. It wasn't true.
8 p.m, and according to the custody records of Bishopsgate Police Station, Catherine Eddowes was arrested for being drunk and incapable.
These two victims in the, almost parallel lives in the sense in a very similar geographic area, both sex workers, lots of people out that night. Why them?
Liz Stride and I lived together as man and wife. She was a very quiet, sober woman.
Witnesses who saw Liz Stride paint a different picture. At 11 p.m, she was seen in the doorway of a pub with an unidentified man. In fact, she was spotted with 3 different men over the course of the next couple of hours. At around 12:45, James Brown, a docker, was returning home when he saw Liz with a man about 5'7" tall, stocky, and wearing a long overcoat. He appeared to be standing in her way, and Brown, who would later identify Stride's body, heard her speak.
Not tonight, maybe some other night.
You've got a series of descriptions of men. It could be a series of different men, it could be a series of different descriptions of the same man.
I think certainly being a sex worker, it's a high-risk activity in itself. It does render victims vulnerable, but it does equally cause a lot of complications at the stage of a major inquiry.
But if you put together everything that we know about what the witnesses have got to say, then you can come up with a composite picture.
John makes the decision to follow the same procedure as would be used in a modern-day murder hunt. He's going to collate all the descriptions given by witnesses. If the police in 1888 had had the image of a suspect to work with, would they have caught him before he killed again? Catherine Eddowes spent until 1 a.m. on the morning of the 30th, safely locked up in Bishopsgate Station. Eventually, the duty officer judged her sober enough to be released, and she set out, back towards Aldgate.
The sad thing is, and I dare say they did notice it, that they'd released her at a time and place when the hunter was out looking for his next victim.
He had already found Liz Stride. Her body lay in Berner Street. When it was discovered at 12:45, it was still warm. The cut to the throat which killed her was still bleeding. She had died less than 5 minutes before. Beyond this single wound, there was nothing else. No mutilation.
The discoverers have actually disturbed the murderer. They've turned into the yard and disturbed the murderer at his work.
The people who disturbed the Ripper weren't quick enough to save Liz Stride's life. They may have unwittingly sealed Catherine Eddowes' fate.
The offender feels they have to complete, they have to satiate some particular need. He's probably pumped up with adrenaline, on the hunt and on the prowl for the next person to make damn sure this time he's going to get that opportunity and he's going to see the offence through, complete it.
We know that the Ripper was in Berners Street around 1 a.m. and we know that he went west to Mitre Square. He can have arrived there no later than 1:30, because when the body of Catherine Eddowes was found at 1:45, it was obvious he had spent some time with it. Catherine Eddowes suffered worse degradation than any of the previous victims.
It could be through anger of the first bungled attempt. Ultimately, he only knows what was his state of mind at that time. Perhaps she has been non-compliant, so he's done something more personal to her in terms of slashing her face, cutting off her nose.
It's possible to place the Ripper in a third location that night. At 2:55, PC Alfred Long was conducting a search in Goulston Street. His eye was drawn to some graffiti, and directly beneath it, a piece of bloodied cloth. It had been cut from an apron that Eddowes was wearing.
It's probably the only thing we know for absolute certain that the murderer took from one scene and put somewhere else.
What's most important about this is the when and the where. In Berners Street, he'd been interrupted. He started hunting again and found Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square. The find in Goulston Street says that he then changed direction. His work was done, the night was over, so where was he heading? Was he making his way home? How close to where he lived did he commit his crimes? 1 week later, a letter arrived with Mr. George Lusk. He was chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a group of local men who patrolled the streets trying to catch the Ripper. The letter was headed from hell. It came with half a human kidney.
Mr. Lusk, sir, I sent you half a kidney I took from one woman and preserved it for you. T'other piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out, if you only wait a while longer. Signed, catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk.
The newspapers and police received hundreds of hoax messages claiming to be from the killer. But none of them have the credibility that this letter carries.
This was a kidney which showed signs of Bright's disease, which was a disease of the kidney that Catherine Eddowes was said to have suffered from. The length of renal artery on the kidney corresponded with the length remaining in Catherine Eddowes' body. Now, if all of these accounts were true, then this clearly gives a lot more credibility to the Lusk letter.
What does the letter reveal about its author? Some people say it's a trick, that the Ripper wrote it as an educated person trying to put people off the scent by appearing semi-literate. Laura turns to forensic linguist Dr. Frances Rock. She specializes in the analysis of this kind of text.
What does it possibly tell us about the offender?
There are words that are interesting, like two words that have E's, as we might see to the modern eye, missing from the end: knife and while. They look like mistakes to us now, but at the time, maybe this author wasn't aware that this was wrong. We can't use this letter to identify one definite author. But we can make all sorts of observations which may help us to think about who the killer might have been. It's unlikely that the writer of this letter will have necessarily had a full education.
This letter offers few revelations, but conspiracy theories aside, the obvious explanation is the likely one. The author was poorly educated. That puts him in the lower classes. For Laura, the letter offers two other clues: the reference to cannibalism and the fact that George Lusk was its recipient.
I've dealt with only 2 cases in 10 years where there's been cannibalism, where an organ's been taken with the intent of actually frying it and then eating it. Perhaps that's something that he wants people to believe, that that's what he's done, to instill more terror, and create that real impact on the local community.
Unlike those letters, which were definitely hoaxes, this one didn't go to the government or the press. Jack didn't seek to have a national or global impact. He sent it to a local community leader. His attention was focused not on the wider world, but on Whitechapel. All the evidence is pointing one way, towards the idea that the Ripper was a local man. On the morning of the 9th of November, 1888, Thomas Bowyer went to Miller's Court in Whitechapel to collect rent from one of his tenants. When he received no answer, he peered through the window. He later told the press that what he'd seen was the work of the devil. The door to Mary Kelly's lodgings was locked. Pieces of her lay around the room. We know less about this fifth victim than any of the others. She was younger than them, around 25. She was said to be pretty, although no photograph of her in life exists. She too was a prostitute, but she was the only one of the Ripper's victims to have a permanent address. She was the only one to be killed inside. What he did to her was perhaps the most extreme violence that it's possible to inflict on a human body.
The face is gashed beyond all recognition. The nose, cheeks, eyebrows and ears being partially removed.
He may have spent hours with the body.
Perhaps it's just that he's comfortable in the area, that he's operating within, and he's managed to control her quite quickly, and then he can do whatever are the things that he wants to do, derived from his own fantasy base.
Both breasts have been removed by more or less circular incisions. The heart is absent.
Most Ripper experts say that this was the last murder, that after Mary Kelly, and for reasons that have never been explained, Jack stopped. Laura has now studied all 5 killings. All the elements she needs are coming together. The DNA tests, the geo-profiling, the computer-generated image of the Ripper's face. With all this information, how close can she come to unmasking him? Laura's completed a detailed psychological analysis of the killer. It's a study based on years of examining the crimes of the most dangerous offenders. Serial killers, multiple rapists, the modern-day counterparts of Jack the Ripper. John Grieve, formerly head of Scotland Yard's murder squad, has been pursuing his own lines of inquiry. He brings news of 2 developments. The first is the result of an attempt to extract DNA from some clothing that was said to have been taken from the body of Catherine Eddowes, the 4th victim. It offered a last chance, more than a century after the murders, to collect forensic evidence directly linked to the Ripper and his victims. But the tests did not reveal DNA.
Well, they haven't got anything useful. There's nothing we could use either evidentially or even from an intelligence point of view, so there's nothing helpful out of the DNA, and there isn't likely to be.
So that line is pretty much closed.
118 years have passed since the murders. All the physical evidence has gone or been contaminated beyond use. And yet there's still plenty of evidence of the kind that doesn't decay. John's been re-examining witness statements.
There's a popular misconception that nobody ever saw the murderer here and he just vanished into the fog of London. Well, that's just not right. There were witnesses who were thought highly of at the time by the police.
13 different people gave descriptions of men seen near the crime scenes or with the victims shortly before the murders.
Of course, there's problems with eyewitnesses, and there are problems with these eyewitnesses.
Some of these statements differ greatly. They're clearly describing different people. But many of them are similar enough that they could well be talking about the same man.
We could pull together all these descriptions and you could come up with a composite.
Working with the data from these statements and police reports, a digital artist has produced an e-fit of the kind used in modern criminal cases. 25 to 35 years of age, 5 feet 5 to 5 feet 7. This is the man that the police of 1888 should have been hunting. Laura can now pair this physical profile with the psychological portrait of the killer. According to her reading, this man was not the criminal mastermind of legend.
He's certainly no Einstein. We know that he's a risk taker. He's impulsive, irresponsible, but this is someone who hasn't been detected, and you can say 80% of that's probably due to chance and luck, and 20% may be down to his tactical planning around what he's done.
And yet, he's clever enough to balance his risks.
He also knows how to get out or leave the scene when things get too risky. We equally know that he's determined. You know, we've got 2 attacks, a double event in one night. He hasn't attacked Liz Stride, bungled it, and decided things are too risky. He's actually gone a mile away and attacked someone else.
The man she describes is socially skilled. It makes him efficient at targeting women.
He would probably be quite a manipulative individual. He'd probably, have the ability to lie quite convincingly. Probably come across on a superficial level as being charming. He could get away with it to a degree, which doesn't rule him out of having short-term relationships with females.
Beneath the surface is a complete lack of normal emotion.
I think he'd certainly have a lack of empathy or remorse or levels of guilt about what he's done. I don't think he would be bothered. He certainly seems to see the victims as object.
It's the combination of these traits, charm, determination, and ruthlessness, hidden by the ability to blend in, that makes him dangerous.
The key point is, if he was so obvious, he would have been put into the inquiry time and time again by lots of different people. This guy, he'd be unassuming, he'd be inoffensive, and he'd be right under their noses.
The place to hunt for him was close to his crimes in Whitechapel. But where? Laura asked geographic profiler Kim Rossmo to look at the case, and he now thinks he can identify the street where the killer was most likely to live. His geo-profiling system has been deployed by police forces around the world to track and catch serial offenders. He's run the 5 Ripper sites through it. The red zones, the peaks, indicate the places where the police should have focused their search.
And I can see that the peak area where the profile is falling on covers Flower and Dean Street, Fashion Street, Thrall Street, here in the center of Whitechapel.
Should the police have been concentrating their efforts here on Flower and Dean Street? Only a short stretch of it survives. It's changed completely since 1888. But census records say what this place was like. One of the worst of London's ghettos, packed with its poorest citizens. The geographic profile says that Jack the Ripper lived here, amongst his victims. It's based purely on where the 5 women were killed, but it fits in perfectly with the victimology, the story of their lives. Because in the year before the murders, each of them lived within 100 yards of this street. The police actually conducted house-to-house inquiries here after the Eddowes murder. No records survive of who they talked to. It's impossible to say just how close they got. But Laura believes that the Ripper would have been interviewed and discounted.
I would expect there to be some form of contact between Jack the Ripper and the police. Many times I've heard officers say, I will know him when I see him, but in all those times, it has never been correct because the offender isn't ever what they perceived him to be. He's someone who's been totally overlooked by very virtue of the fact he's so ordinary and so mundane, and I think that's the whole point here. He's committed an extraordinary set of offences, but he's probably quite an ordinary guy.
This may be as close as it is possible to get to the first modern serial killer. But if the police then had had the tools that are available today, things might have been different. most of us would never have heard of Jack the Ripper. There would be no myth, no mystery.
For somebody who's sitting in the investigating officer's chair, if he'd had all the information that we could give him now, he'd have got it.
Join us tomorrow as the razor-sharp mind of the Belgian detective is at work sifting through the evidence to expose a brutal killer. David Suchet stars in Agatha Christie's Poirot, 8:30 tomorrow night on ABC One.